Perfect. Okay, hello. Very nice to meet you. And thank you for
Nice to
taking
meet
time
you.
to talk with me.
Great being with you.
Yeah. I came across your work, I think it was in Time magazine or something like that, about uncovering Hitler. And for the most part, most of my life, I didn't really want to find out about Hitler unless I had to in school. But I find it quite interesting that you decided to kind of go for it. I mean, I'm from South Africa, and I don't really know many people that enjoy or take the time out to study apartheid. It's something that you hear so much in school that you don't really want to go more for it. And you're from Germany, right?
That's right.
Yeah. So I was quite surprised that you decided to kind of go with it. I know you write in your book that you never imagined you would do it, but how did you actually land up studying Hitler a little bit more in depth?
Sure. There are two questions really here. I suppose it's if you have grown up with a dark past, why would you want to face it? But there's also the more specific question about Adolf Hitler. And I never really had a huge inhibition to face the first, and that really was just always something that fascinated me. I mean, I'd always been fascinated or obsessed with history right from when I was a child. Obviously, not necessarily with the past of the Third Reich. Um, but if you're interested in history anyway, if you're interested in the political anyway, and you grow up in a country in which you then realize that there is a strange disconnect between the people that you encounter, between the generation of your grandparents who you encounter as lovely neighbors who might pass over apples across a fence to you, and realizing what their generation has done. I mean, obviously, this is not to say that your very neighbors necessarily would have been involved in whatever. You just don't know. But you do know that of the many lovely people of that generation, they were not. They were involved in deeds that were anything but lovely. And I think if you're interested in history anyway, that becomes a really fascinating question. And I think it is at that point that I decided that I really would also as a historian face those kinds of questions. But nevertheless, I still thought at that point that I would not want to have to deal with Adolf Hitler, because I just thought that, well, I suppose it was two things. I mean, it's one is that just so much has been published on Adolf Hitler, and I just thought that life is too short to waste my time in just reinventing the wheel. So if there are so many good books on Hitler, why write yet another one? Um, and the other one is, I suppose, also the having grown up in Germany, I was very much part of a generation that believes that that it's really society at large that has to face it's a responsibility, and that we should not somehow just narrow things down to a particular person or something like that. And there is sometimes the insinuation in Germany, which I think is silly, but it exists nevertheless, that by focusing too much on Hitler, we would somehow um, trying to minimize the responsibility of ordinary Germans. And I suppose I was, at least in part initially, also influenced by that. But again, I think it's ultimately a silly proposition, because ultimately it's not the question is not should we look at Hitler or at the German society at large, but what was their interplay? I mean, it's a bit like having to decide whether you would want to look at leaders or its society at large and its structures. It's a bit like having to forcing people to have to decide between the two would be a bit like saying, well, do you think it's more important to drink or to eat? And I mean, you need to do both. And I think the same is true here if you want to understand the Third Reich. And so I suppose also this inhibition that a lot of people felt to deal with Adolf Hitler was something that intrigued me and fascinated me, but in and of itself wouldn't have been enough to spent years of my life going through archives and crawling through, or metaphorically crawling through attics to look for new material, and writing now two fairly big books on Adolf Hitler. But what then really happened was that I had a conversation with a historian and a friend after I finished a previous book where I was trying to find a new topic, and we were discussing possible topics, and we realized that we both agreed that somehow the stories that were being offered about how Hitler became Hitler somehow didn't add up, were unsatisfactory, and that particularly the new emphasis by the early 2000s on the impact of the First World War somehow just didn't sound right. And then we said, well, wouldn't it be an obvious way if we cannot find new documents specifically on Hitler, to look at the bigger picture and to imagine Hitler as a kind of missing piece in a jigsaw puzzle. But if you can find the puzzle pieces from around the missing piece, then you can get a pretty good sense what the missing piece looked like, and whether also the stories that Hitler himself later told about his time in the war and the making of him are credible. And that is how I decided to write this group biography of Hitler's regiment. This is how I decided that I would actually, after all, work on Adolf Hitler. And then, to my great surprise, by looking for the kind of jigsaw puzzles around the missing piece, I did not just find pieces from around that, but also parts of the missing piece itself. So I found a surprising number of new sources specifically on Hitler. And I ended up writing a book which I like to believe really goes against the grain of what people thought by that time. And but I also equally thought that I was done with Hitler at that time. I mean, I obviously felt I had produced a book of some significance. But at the same time, I also felt Hitler out, if you will, after writing the book and going through all the archives and so on. I thought, time to move on. And at that point, one of my publishers some of my publishers were really saying, well, shouldn't you actually also answer the question that you're raising in your book, namely if it is true that Hitler returns from the First World War with still fluctuating ideas, and even Hitler being not fully formed, and more importantly, him being a typical product of his regiment, how do you explain that a year later he is very much the person whom we all know? And I was still resisting that, even though I could see that this was. I could see, particularly the case my German publisher, because Christian Seeger was making, was really very persuasive, but I was still somewhat resistant. But then, when I kept on doing talks about my book, there were these really fascinating discussions, and afterwards people came up saying exactly the same thing. So how do we now make sense of the making of Hitler? And at that point, I thought, again, well, actually, that is really intriguing. I realized that by answering or by solving a previous riddle, I had kind of created a new one, and decided that I would stick with it. But let me just say one more thing in answering your question. I suppose what I also realized that Hitler is a topic, or also trying to make sense of Hitler, is really a topic that really intrigues a lot of people. And I've had, as a result of that, I've had so many interesting conversations where sure, occasionally, particularly early in the day, when people, at that time I was even more junior than I am now, and people would not necessarily know who I am and so on. And if I would then tell them, they say, well, so what are you doing, or what are you working on? And you could see, if I told them I was working on a book on Hitler, how they were trying to avoid rolling their eyes. But at the same time, I've also found that if I talk to ordinary people on planes who ask me, what are you working on, or after talks I give, or what after people have read my book, so many people have approached me and said this is a really important topic for them, and asked me this really intriguing questions, or told me what has touched them. And at that point, I thought that that is actually something quite wonderful. I mean, in a way, it's a privilege to have ordinary people who have very busy lives, who are very tired at night, to uh, spend the little money they have on buying my book, and then to spend their time to read it, and then to kind of engage with me. And in that, and I found that experience uh, quite humbling. But I also realized through that how much we're all still kind of a product of Hitler. I mean, um, whether we want it or not, it's um, Hitler created in many ways the world that we live in. Um, and in that sense, we all are directly or indirectly influenced by him. I mean, there's a saying that we live for 300 years. We live for the kind of up to 100 years that we are around, but we're also really made by the experiences of the people of or what happened for 100 years before us, and we have an impact of what happened 100 years after we are gone. And I think that's very true. And it also really does explain how the world that Adolf Hitler, the horrible world that Adolf Hitler created, and has impacted all our families and all our societies, and that in that sense we're all kind of still struggling to come to terms with that. And in that sense, I find it really intriguing to deal with Adolf Hitler.
Your title of the book, I know that publishers get involved and suggest different ideas for the title, but at first glance, it almost seems like a how-to guide. And I also imagine that a lot of people would at first think that it's somehow apologetic. I think it must be very difficult to write about Hitler and be able to make your stance and what you're trying to do quick enough that people realize what you're trying to achieve. Because majority of books about Hitler seem to either be he wasn't that bad, or just pointing out all the horrible, terrible things he did. And to really take a more scientific approach must have been quite tricky, I imagine.
I think that is true. But that also greatly, as with regards to take a kind of more scholarly or scientific approach, and also just ask uncomfortable questions or tricky questions, is the willingness to accept that it really varies from country to country. So my experience has been, for instance, certainly giving talks in Britain or America, and interesting also in countries like Israel, it's kind of very easy. There is a great openness to engage with any kind of questions, and also to deal with these kind of uncomfortable questions. But I found particularly in Germany, that's really quite different. And I've had this kind of bizarre experience that sometimes when I was after both books, I was doing interviews with journalists in Germany. I would do interviews. There would be great interviews, and normally often great interviews. And then afterwards, once the recording devices were turned off, we would still chat, and they would occasionally say, "Well, can we just ask you a question?" And then they said, "Isn't it risky for your career to write about Hitler? Isn't it risky to try to explain Hitler?" Or even some, as a German journalist said, she said very kindly, said, "I thought your book was really readable. Isn't that a problem for your academic career?" So there are all these kind of strange things going on, and I increasingly realized that, particularly in the case of Germany, there is still a kind of inability to, or maybe not inability is an exaggeration, there is a great difficulty to take Hitler seriously, it's fine to talk either about the kind of 1 or 2-dimensional monster. It's fine to talk about the Hitler who's omnipresent but on the sidelines, where the central figures are always someone else, generally the Germans at large, but that there is a great reluctance and inability to face Hitler head on. I think this is also borne out by the fact that the German filmmaker Nico Hofmann is, of course, arguably the most successful German producer at the moment, that so far he has not managed to find a German channel to buy his planned fictionalized TV series on Hitler's life. And I mean, also in full disclosure, and I mean, it's no secret, that series is supposed to be an adaptation or inspired by the first of my two Hitler books. But the point here is not really about me. The point here is really about the fact that the most successful German producer does not have any problems selling programs on, I mean, as in case of Unsere Mütter, Unsere Väter, of Generation War, on how ordinary Germans were involved in crimes of relating to the Holocaust and the Second World War. But once it comes to dealing directly with Adolf Hitler in a serious fashion, TV channels just don't want to go there. Likewise, the German news program were pulling out of covering up in something that I had found on Hitler, something new on Hitler, and about which they already had produced a film segment the day after neo-Nazi protests happened in Dresden, because they were worried that now dealing with Adolf Hitler would just pour oil into the fire. Where I would say, isn't the opposite the case? Isn't this now precisely the moment where we should be dealing with Adolf Hitler? So I think in that sense, German society really does have a problem to face Hitler head on. Or I think there is a lot of kind of almost a kind of smugness in German society that they say, well, now actually we do this, because not as evident in the fact that, for instance, there are all these comedies about Hitler and Erst wieder da turned into a phenomenal success. So, well, sure, but the ability of turning Hitler into a comedy figure, into a figure to ridicule, clearly is not a sign that you're willing to take Hitler seriously. But there was, of course, also a different part to your question, which was about the title and the becoming Hitler bit, or wie Adolf, or in German, wie Adolf Hitler zum Nazi wurde. Sure, I mean, obviously
that is a little bit more clear.
We also joked about that this might sound like a self-help book, but I mean, it's obviously quite clear for anyone that this is not to buy. This is not meant as a guidebook or handbook for future dictators, but that this is about how Hitler became the man who we all know. And sure, it is maybe somewhat provocative, but I think it precisely puts into 2 words what the book is about. So and it was actually not my publisher. It was both. We're trying to find a title, and the publisher actually asked me without any suggestions, because we're kind of struggling to find something that worked as well as the German title. And I asked both one of my kind of friends and mentors, and as well as of my literary agent. And interestingly, independent from each other, they immediately said Becoming Hitler. And we said, well, wow, it is catchy, but the point is it really does encapsulate what this is precisely about. This is precisely about, well, obviously Adolf Hitler was not born as a monster. I mean, he was not, when he was a baby, it was not clear that he would become the man that he was. And to ask the question of how do you become, or how did Hitler become the person who we all know, and also what role did German society play in that, is precisely what the book is doing. So, and I think the title is perfect.
When I first came to Germany, it took a while for people to get used to my name, but some people saw this Le Prénom, and I think last year it was now made into a German film as well. And in a way, I was happy about As Wieder Da because people were talking about it and able to not flinch when they hear my name. But I agree that it's nothing really new. I mean, Charlie Chaplin managed to make fun of Hitler long ago. It's not really dealing with it very seriously. It's not really asking the question of why did it happen? How did it happen that he had a vision for Germany, and how did it happen that people agreed to follow through with it in the way that they did?
So I agree, but yes, I agree.
It's really kind of scary to try to understand. He had a certain idea and people liked that idea, but the way they actually implemented that idea through the Holocaust and just the war in general, how did those steps actually unfold? And it seems like obviously World War I played a big role in that as well.
Sure, I think that is true, but I think that it's also important. Maybe that's also what I should have said in my far too long answer to your previous question. For one, the question also is: do we just see Hitler as someone who is totally unoriginal and just full of hatred and basically just rages and just wants to take revenge on everyone, which sometimes is the Hitler that we're presented with, certainly in the media, but also in Hitler biographies. And what I've been trying to do is to take Hitler seriously, both as a man of ideas and also as a political operator. What I try to show with him as a man of ideas, that sure, it might be true that, or it's certainly true that that the first principles upon which his worldview is built are irrational and hateful and whatever else. But once you accept those first principles, he is putting these ideas together in a fairly consistent and fairly rational way. So the first principles are irrational, but the way he put things together kind of add up. And also, they're addressed to really identifying what he to identify the primary reasons for Germany's domestic and external weaknesses. Because Hitler precisely was not about just taking revenge. He was not just about emotions, contrary to what is often claimed. He was actually not. People always talk about Adolf Hitler and the Dolchstoß, about kind of taking revenge for the Dolchstoß, or the stab in the back, in Germany's back, supposedly by Jews and socialists and so on. But that's precisely not Hitler's language. I've only come across once or two mentionings of the Dolchstoß by Adolf Hitler. He was talking about he was using scientific language. He was using biologized and medicalized language. And the point here is not whether or not his ideas of medicines and medical metaphors works, but the point here is that he took those seriously and applied them to trying to find solutions that he thinks work once and for all. He also says in his first anti-Semitic letter, written in 1919, he argues against an anti-Semitism of emotions, because he said that an anti-Semitism of emotions will not achieve anything, because it, well, to kind of paraphrase him in a very crude form, he's basically essentially saying, well, you might feel good about yourself, but it's not solving any. By just lashing out against some Jews, that overall problem is still there. So in that sense, he is finding cohesive, incoherent answers in his quest first to understand the world, and then to understand the hidden architecture of the world, and then to apply those to policy. But the other part is to take Hitler serious as a political operator. People often, or scholars often, describe Hitler as a kind of man without talents when it comes into political operations. People point out to how he was responding more to unforeseen circumstances than that he was initiating things, that he was often lazy, that he was sleeping in, and all that. That is all true, but I think it's also a function of scholars, and I guess myself included, obviously, of having no first-hand experience in politics and in decision making. So, as a result of that, we imagine politicians, or an ideal form of politics, is formulating goals and then minutely implementing them step by step. And anything that falls short of that is then seen as ineffectual political operations. But I think the opposite is the case. I think part of the reasons why intellectuals actually tend to, also in the present day, to tend to be unsuccessful politicians is precisely because they don't know how to translate ideas into reality. And the best political operators tend to be those who formulate political goals in fairly abstract terms, or rather fairly unspecific terms, where they do not think about the detail yet on how this can be implemented over the next 5 or 10 years, because that allows them to deal with unforeseen circumstances, because it is the very nature of politics that things are unforeseen and that things happen that you had not anticipated. And successful political operators will respond to those moments of crisis and exploit them in ways that gets them closer to their goals that they have only formulated in very abstract forms. And in that sense, Hitler was an extremely successful political operator. But the third thing I would say is, and it goes back to also what you said about the relationship here between Hitler and the Germans, and why people would actually go for the answers that Hitler was proposing in the public arena. I guess another talent that Hitler had was to not only to formulate these goals for himself in fairly unspecific terms, but to be even less specific in public, so that to go for goals that could be understood in different ways. So where hardcore ideologues and believers, they would really believe everything that Hitler is saying. They would say that even the most extreme of goals mentioned by Hitler are the ones that Hitler really wants. And all the stuff that sounds uncontroversial or more centrist or whatever else, they would say, oh yeah, he doesn't really mean that, he's just doing that for public consumption. But likewise, people who are less radical might say, well, look, all this really radical stuff is ultimately meant um, for the true believers. That's just meant to keep them on his side. He doesn't really mean that. What he really, the real Hitler is the kind of more moderate Hitler. And as a result of that, Hitler managed to create a political persona of himself that allowed pretty much any German to have their own Hitler, to have their own image of Hitler, and thinking that everyone else was wrong. But that also created for Hitler an opportunity to pursue, it created a smokescreen behind which Hitler could pursue his own political goals, which often were, in fact, quite different from the reasons why people stated that they supported Adolf Hitler.
Just reminded a little bit of apartheid in a sense, how you're saying he had certain political goals and he had a vision that he wanted to create, and the way he put it together was the intelligent part of it all. And in the same way, apartheid, the way they actually put it together and got theologians involved and lots of academics to ground this crazy idea was where they really managed to put it all together.
I think that probably sounds right. I mean in the case of Nazi Germany, maybe also in the case of South Africa, but I'm not sure whether I know enough about the South African case to be sure about this. It was not necessarily a case of Hitler specifically saying, well, we need the support of all these intellectuals in order to really put things together. But that is, of course, that doesn't mean that it didn't happen anyway, or that the function of the activities or of the action of these intellectuals and theologians and academics had precisely that effect. I think Hitler himself would have probably really genuinely thought that there was nothing else to say other than what he had come up, and that he had come up with all these great original ideas. But then there was this kind of self-mobilization of thinkers, of theologians, of academics who were attracted by Hitler and who ultimately kind of sorted out the mess in his worldview, and who kind of defended it or made it sound even more to sound it more rational than it was. And I would imagine that is a phenomenon that is pretty universal for authoritarian states of that kind. So I think you would have found similar phenomena in other authoritarian states of the time, both on the left and the right. And I would imagine that's also what happened in apartheid.
Imagine in most cases of war that the leader has some kind of radical idea, and some people support that idea and know how to implement it, and by any means necessary, really, they know how to implement it. And what happens with the ethical and moral questions, they kind of get in a very academic, intelligent way explained as to why this is justifiable.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask you a quick question? I'm just curious, do you recall when you, or rather, if you now look back to your childhood, when is the first time that you kind of became self-aware, at least in hindsight, that there is something different about your name?
I think when I was about 9, someone from high school basically like shouted across the table, like, "Adolf, I'm learning about you in school. You're a really naughty boy." And I didn't understand at the time, and at that moment I noticed there's really something different about my name, and I started to notice going into grade 5, how the new teachers would react to my name.
Right. And was there ever a time where you kind of were either revolting against your name or thinking about using a kind of shortened version of your name? I mean, for instance, the father of an ex-girlfriend of mine is called Adolf, but he has basically all his life just been called Adi. I guess that was his problem to solve, to tackle that problem. Did you ever consider that? Did you ever do that?
Almost the exact opposite.
Interesting.
So my mother wanted to become a pianist, and her professor was Adolf Hallis, and he was quite a famous pianist. He composed some music for Hitchcock films, and he was one of the first to record Debussy piano. So I was always told about Adolf Hallis, and for me, Adolf always meant this great, amazing musician and this great mentor to my mother. So it was always like something that I appreciated. And a lot of people kind of tried to create a nickname for me, and I refused. And I said, my name is Adolf, you have to accept it. And I even remember, like, once in South Africa, you have to get your haircut at school. So I went for a haircut, and there was a German, and she said, I refuse, I'm going to have to use a different name. And it was so strange for me, because you can't really do that with other people's names. You can't be like, Thomas? No, I refuse to call you that. I have an issue with that name. I'm going to call you something else. It sounds very strange. Like you just don't want to accept me as a person. Mm-hmm. So I noticed it, at about 9-10 years old.
And what are your experiences when, I suppose, after moving to Germany, or what's your experience, let's say, if you arrive in Frankfurt Airport or Munich Airport or whatever, and you go up with your South African passport to the border to the border officials, and they look at your name, what kind of responses do you get?
So I think it's difficult to separate that general experience that most people relay and my experience with my name, because most people say the same kind of thing, that they are quite intimidating. Mm-hmm. But the first time I came to Germany, people looked at the passport for a while, looked down, looked at me, and they said, Adolf? And like, what are you doing here? And those kind of questions. So it was difficult. Like, am I not welcome? What's the problem? And I think for the most part, Germans are a lot more scared to say my name and to think about it. I've had people straight up laughing, saying it's a good joke, but really, what is your name? Telling me they refuse to use my name. I have to use my second name. Or I've been told that there's something wrong with my parents, and a number of exciting things. And basically, I know a lot of people do use a nickname or use their second name or something like that. And for me, I always wanted people to just accept it for what it is.
In a way, it is strange, isn't it? It's just that I can't think of any other name or any other historical figure for whom the same is true. I mean, certainly not to the same extent, but I'm thinking whether there are other figures where there is a kind of, where one person basically has killed a name. Can you think of any?
I mean, they bring it up in Le Prénom, where they mention a lot of names, and they say like Jack the Ripper and Joseph Stalin, and all of those names somehow didn't manage, even though they were potentially worse. And actually, if you go by the person responsible for the most amount of deaths, he allowed for lead to be part of fuel and said that it's not poisonous, and he created CFC gases. And like, if you really want to go for the person singularly responsible for the most deaths, it's Thomas Midgley. So as I said, I have a problem with your name. because Thomas Midgley is responsible for the most of deaths. But when I discussed this with Adolf Anthony, he's a genealogist, he said maybe Guy Fawkes is a similar situation where after Guy Fawkes, the name Guy did drop out of use. But I've met two people named Guy before, and I've never, they didn't say that people say, oh, like Guy Fawkes.
Exactly. Well, I mean, of course, it's possible that historically it went out of use, but of course the question then still is that a correlation? Is there a correlation or is there a causal effect? Because, I mean, in the case of Adolf Hitler, it's quite clear that it's not a correlation but a causal effect. But there's been this really interesting work. I mean, there's this American sociologist who has looked at how names follow the same pattern as generally fashions, and what the and how therefore names become fashionable, but also fall out of fashion. And I think in the case of Guy Fawkes, one would really have got to look into whether there's any evidence of that being more than a name falling out of fashion.
As per usual.
Yeah.
Then I could also imagine 100 years later that people think Guy is a nice name. He was a rebel. Wherefore, for supporting rebels who went against status quo, and the reason connected to what he actually did and what he represents within the understanding 100 years after the fact would also change how we view those names.
Sure.
Names like Vladimir after Vlad the Impaler also, is it just a common name that's used for so long that people can't ruin it? But what's fascinating about Hitler is that he didn't only ruin a name, he also ruined a lucky symbol, the swastika, and a mustache style. He really did a number.
Right. But I suppose I think what's happening with Hitler, it's not just the I mean, I guess there are two ways of answering what we're just describing. One would be say, well, the reason for this happening is because what Hitler did was just so much more horrible and so much more extreme and whatever else than what anyone else, what any other dictator or leader did, and it's totally different on a totally different scale. And it's a different kind. It's not just different scale. It's a totally different kind of crimes. I'm not sure whether I'm convinced that that is the main reason. I mean, for one, I'm not sure whether it's even true. And this is not to minimize Hitler's crimes, but by pointing out that you can actually find a lot of people whose crimes are comparable. I don't think that minimizes Hitler's crimes, but the real issue I think here is that Hitler has become the symbol for all of these crimes, for all of these dictators. So that actually, in a way, it's precisely the opposite. It's not him being a totally different kind, or his crimes being a different kind, but rather maybe because of the extremity and the scale, he happens to have become the symbol of all those crimes. Because I mean, we always have got to have symbols. I think it's in kind of human nature. It's certainly true with kind of war. I mean, if you talk about the First World War in Britain, people talk about the Somme, or in Germany, Verdun, or Stalingrad for the Second World War, or the Holocaust. People immediately think about Auschwitz. And in a way, it's kind of inevitable to do that, because you cannot in a kind of categorize things and talk about things if you actually have got to now talk about six death camps and lots of other camps and killing by machine guns and so on. So I think inevitably we always have got to have symbols, and I think the same is true outside of history and outside of politics as well. And I suppose because Hitler has become the dominant symbol, both for dictator, but in a way for anything that can go wrong in the human condition. I would imagine that that is why he so lastingly has destroyed a name, has a mustache style. And what was this that thing that you mentioned?
The lucky symbol, the
Oh
swastika.
yeah, the swastika.
Yeah, I think it's a mechanism of scapegoating, that all the evil of all history of, I mean, if you look at all the Chinese emperors that wiped out half of their own people in the name of unification, and multiple other wars where not quite as terrible as World War II, but perhaps in comparison of what percentage of a population were murdered in the name of a vision, Adolf Hitler basically just became the scapegoat for all of those atrocities, and it's an easy symbol to compare everything to.
Yeah, I think I agree with that with you. I'm not sure whether I would use the word scapegoat, because scapegoat would as somehow
The scapegoat is innocent. Yes, that is the wrong word.
scapegoat would somehow say that someone who is innocent is being blamed for that. I mean, it maybe it's true in the sense Hitler is innocent of having killed a large percentage of the Chinese population or whatever. I personally would use the term symbol. But at the same time, I can see why you would use the word scapegoat, because, again, of course, he is being. No, actually, I'm not sure, because the symbol just means that stands for that kind of behavior, but a scapegoating would mean that it's not just about whether or not the person is generally innocent, which of course Hitler isn't, but that there is an insinuation that Hitler is somehow is somehow responsible for what happened in Cambodia or whatever, which I don't think anyone is really saying. So in that sense, I personally would probably not use the word scapegoat.
I just see a similar mechanism of how it's easy to pin everything onto him and make comparisons to him. Just use him as, yeah, I agree. Symbol is a better way of putting it, that he's a symbol of evil. And often people that don't even know much about Hitler, if you ask what is the epitome of evil, then that's just the go-to terminology to use.
I think that's right, and I think it's also interesting that you use the word evil here, because the Hitler, just like the term evil, is this kind of wishy-washy term that analytically is not particularly useful, but that can still be used easily to categorize things. I mean, what I sometimes use, I mean, I ask when my students use the word evil, I tend to kind of say, okay, fine, but what do you mean with that? Is this a useful category? And we then normally quickly realize that unless you use the word evil to give connotation to actions or deeds of other people that you think are horrendous, which is not the technical meaning of evil, because evil, of course, focuses on the intentions, it becomes so if you strip that away, but that's of course how we most use it, or most of us use it, then it becomes a term that it either is a kind of religious philosophical term, in which case it does make sense, but outside of the world of religion, the term is analytically doesn't really help much, because an evil person would be, I guess, in a religious sense, would be someone who sides with Satan, who sides with the fallen angel, who sides with, who self-intentionally wants to inflict harm onto other people and enjoys doing so. But in reality, of course, with the exception of a small number of people with a certain pathology, for whom would that really be true? Even Hitler arguably does not fulfill the criteria of that kind of being evil. But I think the point here being is, even Hitler is not evil in that sense, but we still find the use of the term evil, as well as the Hitler, as a short form for all kinds of things that are not particularly well defined, and that if we really push them to their limits, kind of just collapse.
How do you think are useful ways of pushing these terms to the limits? Like, what I'm trying to do is that people's idea of the word Adolf is just only associated with Hitler and evil. And what I'm trying to do is mention the hundreds of other people named Adolf that actually made a pretty good change on the world. What other ways are there of dealing with the issue behind the name?
It's a good question. I'm not sure what the answer is. I mean, I think in a way it is actually really just to point out that it's a symbol. The name Adolf is a symbol for, or rather, Hitler is the symbol for, has become the symbol for everything that's bad in the world, or rather, is a symbol for the human condition in its most extreme form. And that as a result of that, his name has become part of that symbol. So I think all one can really do is either in a very rational way or in a joking way to try to explain to people that that is a bit silly, or rather maybe it's not silly, but that is what it is, and that therefore there's no reason why people should have the kind of reaction that they give to your names. I think it might also be to say, maybe I'm here too optimistic, but if people tell you that they refuse to use the name or whatever else, and they share the view, is to say, well, look, I feel your pain, I understand where you're coming from, and I appreciate where you're coming from, but I personally think this is rude, and here's the reason why. You could say it's fine that you want to use this as a symbol, but you cannot reduce it to it being a symbol. You have got to be able to go beyond the use of that symbol. And no doubt, I think you would not always succeed, but if you occasionally get people to start thinking, maybe then that's a progress. What do you think?
I was once in a situation where somebody said I wouldn't want to be even remotely associated with Hitler and with the name Adolf. And unfortunately for this person, they were wearing Adidas shoes. And when I pointed it out, they were like, oh. And I think it's quite useful to have some really big name brands and really world changing things, like Paramount Pictures was founded by Adolf Zukor, and they also really large symbols which help people to understand that we can't just focus on this one issue. We have to look at all the other ways that this word could be understood.
Sure, but I think in a way there you're just saying is, I think that that's effective, but I think it also just shows that you explain that the name has become a symbol. But by doing so, you do not necessarily destroy the symbol. And the issue, of course, also is that inevitably people people have to think in shorthand. They have to think in symbols, and therefore they encounter phenomena in the world that could just as easily have become symbols, but it's also true that they haven't. So, I mean, most people don't know that Adidas was founded by Adolf Dassler. But likewise, you could say, even why is this even just about Adolf? You could equally say, shouldn't, if Hitler was so much loving Alsatian dogs, and he was, why are we still having Alsatian dogs? Or you would say the word, he himself, the symbol he was using for himself was actually not Adolf but Wolf. Why we're still allowing the word wolf, a wolf, being used for anything? Why do we accept that people wear Jack Wolfskin coats? You could say that is much closer to Hitler's own imagery than the word Adolf, or you could say that about other things that he liked or that he represents. Or again, I mean, sticking with the example of the Holocaust, people only associate generally Auschwitz with it, or even when it comes to Auschwitz, what people really, I would imagine, the one image they have in front of them are the tracks running into Auschwitz. The famous picture of the tracks leading up into the kind of entry of the camp. And I think it is very difficult to move beyond those signs, but I think maybe one way of doing so is to say is precisely to say, well, look, for anything in life, we're using symbols, whether it's political, whether it's a good thing, whether it's a bad thing, whether it's a holiday, whether it's Christmas, whatever it is, whether it's certain kind of foods. I mean, it's a kind of thing, when sometimes people do these interviews or doctors do this for tests or whatever, where you just these kind of associational tests where someone just says, what do I say? I say Mexico or I say holiday, and you have to tell me without thinking what comes to your head. That precisely identifies all the symbols that in your head, and I think you will all have hundreds of thousands or millions of symbols in our head. And I think the best way of doing this is actually not to try to destroy the symbol, but to actually say, look, you have millions of symbols or million of shorthand symbols in your head. And pretty much in all of those cases, you're aware that they're symbols. You're aware that the word that you use for those symbols, the images that you use for those symbols can be used in different ways. Isn't it a bit silly that you use this one symbol, the symbol Adolf, and reduce it to this one use? So in that sense, I mean, look, this is your life, this is not my life, but I think in your position, I probably would not try to destroy the symbol, but rather to explain that it is a symbol and it's fine that it's a symbol. I would say, well, I understand it's a symbol, but the name is more than the symbol. And I would say the same is true for every shorthand symbol that is in our head. And again, we have millions of those in our heads. And so all I'm saying, therefore, is I would like you to be able to move beyond this kind of reducing the name to only that symbol. I would say I understand that you have that connotation that comes to your mind, but likewise, I think it's rude if you don't call me by that name, if that is my name, if that you don't appreciate that I have different connotations with that name, and by not calling that me, you're rejecting me. You're rejecting who I am. You're rejecting the person who I'm named after. And I think it is this kind of respectful way of trying to make people feel uncomfortable, how you might be able to destroy the exclusive use of that name as just a shorthand symbol. But I don't think that you will, at least not over the next 20 or 30 or 50 or 100 years, destroy the symbol, because that's how how human nature works. We do function through shorthand symbols.
I've been trying to look at approaching it from an idea of prejudice, and what a couple of people are saying when they study prejudice is the gut reaction is trying to destroy prejudice, but what they find a lot more useful is actually to have lots of different prejudices fighting against each other. And that's when it makes it collapse on its own. But when you specifically try to go against one prejudice, then it actually can reinforce that prejudice. And they also found that people don't have a set prejudice, but a kind of moving scale of prejudice. They find that actually when people are more happy, they're less prejudiced. So the problem is when I introduce myself, people already have this very tense feeling, and it kind of triggers it even further. So if they're in a happier state, this idea would say that they're more okay with accepting it. But because Adolf just brings on so many negative connotations for people, it already makes them a little bit tense, and it kind of reinforces that prejudice a little bit.
I think that makes sense. And I think by facing all of them, I think you're right. That's one way of destroying it. But maybe also in practical terms, I think it's also taking people on a journey. You will not necessarily maybe if I were you, if someone says, look, I really can't call you Adolf. Can I call you whatever, Mark? And I said, maybe say kind of jokingly, maybe I would say jokingly, sure, for the next 3 weeks you can call me whatever you'd like to call me, as long as I know that is I. But maybe in 3 weeks' time, once you know me a little bit better, once you know with me that there is, I would like you to reconsider what you call me. Because I think what you would then do through that is people to move beyond the symbol, to actually see or to create a new symbol, because then they would actually suddenly realize there's this lovely guy, there's this lovely South African guy who is Adolf, whom I like for all kinds of reasons. And I think it is maybe at that point that the sole association of the name with that can be reduced. Because, of course, the problem here also, or it can be changed. The problem, of course, here also is with your name, is that the symbol has, of course, self-reinforcing consequences, because in most cases today, the use Adolf is only used positively by people who probably neither I nor you particularly appreciate.
Yes.
And as a result of that, on first encountering you, there is this fear that is precisely you're encountering with. Look, if I mean, or obviously it's a hypothetical because I first encountered you via an email, and now I only see what you look like and so on. But if I had just encountered you and we would have started to chat and you would have said, "Hi, I'm Adolf," I probably would. I think I've encountered enough phenomena of this kind that I'd like to believe that I would have immediately said, "Oh, well, that's really interesting. Where is this coming from?" Because I would see, even on first seeing you, I would see various indicators that would not point towards a neo-Nazi ideology. But I also have to say, when your email first popped up in my inbox, and I think it was just that it was one of the things where I think it popped up where you first just see the name from who it comes rather than the contents. I personally thought, oh, not another neo-Nazi who wants to threaten me, because it's of course also true if you work on Adolf Hitler, you do get undue attention from people who have an undue love for Hitler. So inevitably, I've had threats. I had to give once a talk under police protection. I get unpleasant emails. I get unpleasant letters, and so on. So in that sense, I was also conditioned. I like to believe I'm more open in those things than most. At the same time, I'm still conditioned in a certain way. So if an email pops up in my inbox where I haven't seen yet the subject, and I just see as the sender name Adolf, my past experience is, oh no, here's another email from someone who wants to tell me that I stink, that I'm a Jew, that I'm a liar, or who wants to threaten me. So I think, the bottom line of that is, I think that is the kind of starting point, which might be unfair to you, but it's a starting point nevertheless. So I think in that sense, all one can do is really to try to take people, to invite them to enter an intellectual journey, and say that I understand that you might find, and to also appreciate that emotionally it might be a longer journey for them than rationally. You would probably find that once you have this kind of conversation, that some people still say, well, I still find it weird that this guy is called Adolf, or that his parents would have made that choice even if the pianist was of that name. But people still, in a rational way, probably understand that. But I still think they would have an emotional rejection of that. And I think that that kind of emotional response to that can only be overcome over time, which I suppose is why I kind of jokingly said that maybe if I were in your position, I would say, well, if you want to call me Daniel for the next 3 weeks, fine. But I really would love that in 3 weeks' time, we can discuss again what name you would want to use from that point onwards.
I spoke 2 weeks ago with another South African, Adolf, and he said that he wrote down his name and second name, and the teacher in the course asked, well, which name should I use? And he said, you can pick. So for the rest of the semester, his name was Pick. I quite enjoyed that. Well, I think this really what I'm trying to do is, I understand that rationally could convince people about it, but emotionally is where people really have the problem. And I think people have a very positive emotional feeling about Paramount Pictures and Adidas and the guitars that the Beatles played on and the invention of contact lenses. And there's just, I've been collecting basically as many Wikipedia articles and other articles about anyone named Adolf, and so far I'm at about 400.
Mm-hmm.
So there are just so many examples of positive, good emotional feelings to have. And like you said, I understand people only have one symbolic idea of what Adolf means, but for me, it at the moment is about 600 different meanings of different people that did amazing things. That's what I really want to try and to introduce.
No, and I think that's great. And I think in a way, I'm not entirely sure where you'll go with your project. Maybe you can tell me about this a bit more in a minute. But for instance, if you could write a short book or do a documentary or do a long article or something like that, where you precisely make those points, I think that would be really fascinating, would be very powerful. I mean, I would probably be careful to just basically just make this as, I think if this is a story, but look, there are also other adults in life who were lovely adults and who did do great things for the world. I mean, you could do that, but I think ultimately that would not be as effective as if you would then connect it with the kind of discussion of these, or what we've just discussed, how symbols work and so on. Because I think, again, I think on a kind of an abstract level, I think most people would agree that there must be other Adolfs in human history, both recent and not so recent, who did great things. So in that sense, that's the beyond the kind of thing of, I didn't know that Adidas stands for Adolf Dassler. I think you're not achieving too much beyond that. But I think if you can connect this with a kind of smart discussion of how we all think in shorthand symbols, and to basically explain the genesis of Adolf as a shorthand symbol, then you would do something really fascinating that would also intrigue people, and that would have something also more to say other than to maybe in some small ways change to help change the connotations of the name Adolf. You may want to look at an article a colleague and friend of mine has written, Gabriel Rosenfeld. He wrote an article a few months ago about Hitler as about Hitler analogies, and he has looked both at how people initially, when Hitler first appeared on the German and then the world stage, he has looked at analogies, historical analogies people were using to try to make sense of Adolf Hitler. So what kind of historical circumstances and what kind of dark figures from the past did people invoke in trying to make sense of this new phenomenon, of this new guy, of this new politician in Bavaria? But he then also shows how over time, things flip, how over time Hitler himself became a symbol when it was no longer possible to use analogies to become Hitler, because Hitler had become something in his own right, and how Hitler then turned into an analogy, and how Hitler turned into the dominant analogy for everything that's bad in the world. And so you may find that article interesting to read.
I can imagine that at the time they must have said, this is a new Napoleon coming along.
Yeah, Napoleon was one of the figures, yeah.
And at what stage does he separate from being compared to other people and becoming an analogy of his own? Huh? That's quite fascinating. Yeah. Thank you. You've given me hundreds of thoughts of how to continue and how to interact with this problem.
Great. No, I've really enjoyed this. And if you want to have another chat at some point, just let me know and keep me up to date about your project. Sounds really fascinating.
Yes, first need to finish my PhD, but yes, I will continue with my project.
Good luck.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Nice meeting you. Bye.
Likewise. Bye.